Hey guys, well, with so many marketing options out there and so many things to do, when it comes to podcasts, you can really be thinking like, that's just another piece, that's just something else for me to do. Is it actually going to move the needle in my business? Is it actually going to monetize? And that's what we're going to be talking about today. In fact, I got a really gnarly guest that you can hopefully see here, and I'm going to be introducing Alex in just a moment, but I just want to share with you some of the stats so you can see the opportunities on a podcast as both a guest and also as a host. Now, don't forget in the chats, in the comments, to come along and say hi. Let us know where you are joining us here from. If you are joining us live, put hashtag live. And if you are watching the replay, go hashtag replay and be part of the conversation, because Alex has some absolute genius to share today. And if you are not truly leveraging the power of podcast, that is all going to change. So let's have a look at some stats, guys. So in the US, 51%, so more than 1 in every 2 people listen to podcasts daily. And that number, the number of podcasts that they listen to, has jumped in the last couple of years from 5 podcasts, 5 different shows per week, to 7 different shows per week. And that means that 8 out of every 10 podcast listeners are also spending more than 7 hours per week or more than 1 hour per day listening to podcasts. So you really do have a captive audience. And in fact, the opportunities are absolutely amazing. Just in the US, there are 850,000 podcasts, and more than 30 million podcast episodes. So if you are looking to get booked to speak, there are literally millions and millions of opportunities there for you. And of course, speaking of guests, Alex, so pleased to have you here join us. Now, Alex, you are the host of a Top 20 Entrepreneur podcast. And Alex, I'm going to get you to pronounce your surname again for me.
Sure, Alex Sanfilippo.
Sanfilippo, thank you so much, Alex. Sometimes with the Australian accent, it can be a little bit of a struggle. So, Alex Sanfilippo, so excited to have you here joining us, Alex, sharing your genius into, how we can truly achieve your goals and win as a podcaster this year, and of course get a top 100 podcast as well. And Alex, I would love for you to also share with us about your PodMatch site, which is kind of like a dating site, but for podcasters. And I'm just going to drop a link up there for you guys as well, so you can check it out. So can you tell us about PodMatch?
Definitely. First off, Tanya, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate your time, and I'm a fan of what you do, so I'm just honored to be here today. So PodMatch, to start you off real quick, you have a link right there, which is perfect, because that link will actually let you create a free account. So make sure that you use that account, and that's on behalf of Tanya. So thank you so much for that. That's really nice of you to do for your audience. PodMatch, I started this because I noticed that there was a need. And this was a need I had as well. Finding the right guest for my show is difficult. I could find people who say, yeah, I want to be a guest on your show, but you and I both know often it's not the right people that are reaching out. But finding the right ones was kind of difficult at times. And I went to a podcasting conference and realized that there was authors, course creators, service providers, all types of people that wanted to be on shows. And they had the same problem that I had. They're like, well, I can find podcasts to be on, but they're not the right ones for me. So I wanted to create a solution for that. And because I don't have the best ideas ever, I decided not to reinvent the wheel. I was just like, well, online dating apps seem to do pretty good. A lot of my friends have gotten married through those things. Like, maybe we could build something like that, but for podcasters. So that's exactly what we did with PodMatch. It's just a way to automatically match a guest and a host together for an ideal interview.
Yeah, I love that. And, I'm part of PodMatch. I was going through it and I was like, this is really, really smart. And what's really cool about it too is like, I've had a couple of people approach me to be a guest, and I go and check it out, and it's like, no match, swipe right. Like, right. I didn't even have to say anything. I just politely declined. But speaking of audiences, and I'm going to share this too, because some of you might be thinking, well, because you talk about having the right guests on the right show, and obviously you want to make sure that, and we're going to talk about that, like, how do I find the best podcasts in my audience? But who is actually listening to podcasts? And the stats here, again, are quite interesting. It's pretty split down the middle. So men and women, about 51% of podcast listeners are actually men, and 49% are women. So, if your avatar, if your audience are primarily women, this is a great medium for you. Likewise, if it's for men as well. And when it comes to these demographics, there's also some really great stats in your favor there too, in terms of annual income. So household income is on the higher side, and also education, college degrees are also on the higher side, which I think is really important, Alex, when we're thinking about, because people talk about, well, I'm going to be on Instagram or I'm going to be on Facebook, but is that where your people are? So when you know the age group, the household income, the education, and that's a perfect match with podcasting, then that starts to get really, really exciting. And also in terms of age groups as well. So the demographics are really interesting. A larger portion are under the age of 35, but you also have a growing number above 35. And the number of people listening to podcasts each year is growing at a rate of 30%. So hopefully you guys are convinced, if you haven't already started leveraging them, or you're thinking about hosting a podcast, if you were sitting on the fence, hopefully that is going to push you off. And I just want to say a quick hi, guys. If you can let me know your name, because sometimes I can see names, sometimes I can't. I'm live streaming through StreamYard. I can see some of you joining from Southern California, from Los Angeles, and also from New Jersey joining us live. So welcome, welcome, welcome. And yeah, PodMatch is phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. So I recommend you go and check it out. I'm going to put that link back up in a minute. But Alex, I do kind of wonder, right? Because you've been doing a podcast for a while. You're very successful at it. Top 100 podcasts. What is it you wish you knew back then when you first started that you know now?
A lot. Let's put it that way. Let's start there. The first thing I'd say that I wish I would have known is that it wasn't as scary as I thought it was going to be. The first time I sat down, when I said, okay, I'm going to start a podcast, and I started looking at everything, I got really overwhelmed really fast because it seems like there's a lot to do, when in reality, there's really just a few things that matter to it. And I think that so many people, they don't actually take the time to really look at it and to research it. There's some great people you can find on YouTube that'll explain everything all the way through, or you can just find experts in the area of editing, the equipment that you use, because that is kind of important, right? The idea of figuring out your ideal audience, your ideal avatar. All these things are really important to do, and they seem scary at first. So day one, again, like for me, I was like, oh man, I don't know if I can do this. And it took me a really long time to launch because I was just nervous about like all the things that I thought came along with it. In reality, I should have just started doing everything that I knew how to do. So when I knew the equipment I should buy, I should have just went out and bought that instead of waiting until I was like, okay, well, I need to figure out what editing software I'm going to use and this and this. And I'm not saying like ready, fire, aim type of thing. Like you want to still be strategic, but you want to move quicker than you think you should. So for me, I know I'm going on a little bit here, but this is a big deal. Like people just get nervous and they just stop before they even get started. So my thing is just go after one piece at a time, figure out exactly what you need and go after it. And there's a lot of great resources out there. Like I have these resources, but a lot of other people do as well. And it's not as daunting as you think. Just find someone great to follow that's done it and see what they say that they need. And you can kind of go from there.
I think, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, sometimes people talk about speaking and they go, it's great for brand awareness, but it's not necessarily great for income. And that's a really common misbelief. And I hear that in podcasts. In fact, I reached out to my community and I said, hey, what questions do you have for Alex? And one of those questions was, can I actually, make money from podcasting, and what's the best way to do that? So if someone's looking at monetizing podcasts, Alex, firstly, can you do that? How do you do it? And then if you're going to be doing that, if you're a guest, how many shows should be on per month? I know that's 3 questions. It's very bad journalism right there.
You're okay. I'll go with the start is can you really monetize a podcast? And the answer is absolutely you can. And really at any point. The thing is so many people their mind is fixated on advertising because that's what social media has taught us, right? If you're using Instagram or Facebook or Twitter, advertising is the way to go. So when we think podcasting, we think, okay, I'm going to grow an audience and then I'm going to get some advertisers and then I'm going to be making a lot of money. The truth is, it's really hard to make a lot of money advertising on a podcast. You have to have a really big audience. And here's the thing, if you do podcasting right and you build a really narrow audience, which you should, then some of those areas that you're trying to actually say, okay, I'm going to get an advertiser now, there's not enough people that will ever listen to your show. Like you might pick a niche that there's only a few thousand people ever listen. If you have less than 20,000 people listen to your podcast on a monthly basis, you can't live off of advertising. Even some people say it's even higher than that. I had somebody tell me it was nearly 100,000 people to even like break even. And so that, like, I don't say it to be discouraging, but advertising is not the only option. I want to make sure that people understand that there's a lot of better ways to do things. The one that I really enjoy that I've been seeing a lot more people do is they have some sort of, again, you have to have a really narrow focus on your podcast. It can't be a general. It can't be like Alex Sanfilippo's conversations about everything, because then I can't advertise in any great way anyway, but also I can't have a good call to action. So this is what I really like, someone to have a call to action. So basically what I mean by that is if you are talking to, let's just say, people that are coaching in the fitness space. So they're like fitness coaches, and they want to bring, you're talking about like bringing more revenue to their, or like reoccurring revenue to their portfolio, right? What you can do is you can create a very short course or some sort of giveaway, just a low barrier to entry that you can give away for free to somebody and say, okay, hey, thanks for listening to the podcast. Be sure to go to fitnesscoach.com. I don't know what that is, but anyway, you can go there and you can get this for free. Just put in your email address, and from there you can start doing some upsells. That's the biggest way that I see people do, like, get really successful with podcasting and monetizing it, is because it's just the top of their funnel and they treat it that way. They give something away for free and they just continue going down that funnel. And that's the best way that I've seen people do that. Another thing you can do that a lot of people don't necessarily think about is you can actually use your guests to potentially be clients of yours. I've been on some podcasts that I now actually am a customer of the person who had me on the show, because they did a really great job, but also they showed off what they were able to do. So some of them were like video experts. So they were able to do like a video like this, but then they did some like really cool things with the video of me. And I was like reaching back out, I'm like, how did you do all that? Can I get that video? Could you make more if I send you videos? That type of thing. So you can actually sell things to people if you're in the digital space. And those are a couple ways. I could definitely go into more, Tanya, but I think I'll stop there. And I know the next question was something along the line. How often should you be a guest on shows? Is that right?
Well, yeah. And I was actually just going to pop up like a little summary there for you guys, like in terms of, so, what Alex was just sharing is, you mentioned the point about advertising. And when I was, guys, for those of you who don't know me, I'm Tanya Target Camacho. I'm actually a former investigative news journalist and an award-winning reporter. And so I was, and I'm a total stat nerd. So in preparing for my interview here with Alex, I was looking at all these different stats. And what was really interesting actually about podcast audiences, Alex, is that they are actually more amenable and open to advertising on a podcast than any other platform, which is really great news for advertising. But if you don't have the budget for that, or you don't have the numbers for that, I love how you talked about having some kind of lead magnet so you can be collecting leads, and also doing power partnerships and joint venture affiliates. So for those of you who sort of didn't catch that, I just wanted to suggest that, because podcasts are incredibly powerful. With like 850,000, podcasts and 30 million episodes, how many of those you need to feature on to move the dial in your business? But Alex, you mentioned something before, and my little journalist ears pricked up, and you said, if your audience is narrow, and it should be. Can you dive into what you meant by that?
Yeah, I'm glad you kind of hit that point, because that's a really important one that so many people just skip over. Again, the general podcast days are kind of over. I think initially, if you would have launched in, I don't know when they started. I mean, they're like 20 years old or something like that. So if you would have started 20 years ago, you could have a podcast called Alex's Podcast About Everything. And it probably would have done really well. But now, because you mentioned how many podcasts there are a lot. Although I will say this as a side note on the stats, the listenership is growing faster than the amount of podcasts. So for anyone who's like, oh, it sounds saturated, there's a lot of podcasts. There are a lot, but people are listening to them at a faster rate. That's growing faster than the number of podcasts are starting.
Is that really? That's really interesting. So, and that's a really great point again. And I was also reading that I think like 65% of people listen to a podcast on their phone. And because they listen to it on their phone, it has a much higher playthrough rate, meaning the entire episode is consumed. So, and what you're saying, Alex, is that there are more and more and more listeners. So if you have a podcast, I guess the opportunity is really great right now.
It is. And going back to the point, if you have a narrow focus. So again, if you're general, you're not the one that's getting the listeners. And I talk to people almost every day. They're like, well, my podcast is about my boat, and it's about what I do for work. And I also like to cut my lawn. So it's about that too. And I like to talk about my family. And all those things are great. And if you just want to have a podcast just for fun, like that is perfectly fine, but you can't ever expect to have millions of downloads or thousands of downloads. It's got to be really focused. And here's an example of that. I met this lady and had the opportunity to chat with her. And I thought she had a really small podcast because of how narrow her focus was. Get this. It was for empty nesting mothers that are single and have HIV. And that was her audience. And she has tens of thousands of listeners, and it's one of the most engaged podcasts I've ever seen. Everybody consumes 100% of it. They're all her customers. But at first I was like, how many people could really be struggling with that? The truth is, 10, 20,000 people in the world, and she is the only person talking to those people. Therefore, they all go to the one source that there is. And so that's like a really extreme example. For me, I talk to entrepreneurs that are just getting started in their business. So they're trying to make that first step on their side hustle or their startup. That's who I talk to. So that's somewhat narrow, but the more narrow you can make that, the better. And for me, it all really comes down to knowing your avatar. Like, who is the person that you ultimately serve? So your avatar is just your most ideal listener. And I've gotten really extreme with this. Like, my avatar has a name. His name is Adam. And I explain when he's listening to the podcast, where he's at, what he's working on. Like, I have all those details figured out. So I really know that that's who I'm talking to. And the better people can do with this, the more narrow you can make your podcast and really get it focused on what you're going for.
Yeah, I'm the same. Mine's called Susan,
okay.
And she reads the New York Times, and I know that she drinks coffee and her favorite. But absolutely, like visualizing that person.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that would lead into some of the most common mistakes when it comes to making that podcast. And don't worry, guys, I haven't forgot the previous question, and we'll get back to that, Alex, which is how many times should I be on a podcast if I want to monetize it?
Stay tuned for that, right?
Yeah, stay tuned for that. That's right. So I love that. So, if you're talking about, it's not just niching, it's micro niching. That's right. It's really, really knowing that audience. What would be some of the other common mistakes people make as a podcast host? We're going to cover both sides here today, guys. So I've got some questions that you guys have sent in about being a guest, like what should be on your bio to get booked, and what should you never have, and what should you have. But let's just touch on this common mistakes that people make when they're hosting a podcast.
Yeah, the very first one I see people making, and I touched on this earlier, is just not getting started. It's so important to just start today. Start before you're ready. And I think it was, I can't remember who said this quote, but continuous improvement is better than delayed perfection. Continuous improvement is better than delayed perfection. And that's so important for people to remember, is to just go ahead and get started today. Do the best you can. If all you have is your phone and that's all you can launch with, then do that. I mean, that's how I started. I started just recording into my phone. I didn't even know what a mic was. I mean, I was so out of my league on this thing. And I'll mention one other thing that's another really big one I see. People try to start a podcast, but they also want to launch the website, the Instagram, the Twitter, the LinkedIn, the Facebook, all the things, right? Like, everyone wants all those things. And I always tell those people, what is it that you want to do? Do you want to be a YouTube star, or do you want to be a podcaster? Pick one or the other. And it's really important that we actually do that. And it was, I'm blanking on who said this quote as well, but the man who chases two rabbits catches neither. And that's so true, because I see people that are like, oh, I want to launch the podcast, but first I need to get my Instagram following up a little bit more. No, launch the podcast and then worry about that stuff later. When you really have got the podcast down, work into something else. The mistake that I made launching was I thought I needed all those things, and I tried working on all of them. But the truth is, I wasn't good at any of them because I was spread so thin trying to keep up with everything. And then I stopped all of it. When I got good at podcasting, I figured out, okay, let me go to LinkedIn, and I'm just going to do LinkedIn. And I've actually never gotten past that because it does so well for me. So I think a lot of people, that's another mistake that they make. They don't launch on time. They take way too long to do it. And the other thing is they think they need all the things with it. And the truth is you don't. You just need to go for it. And I think those are two big points that I would share here right now.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And, so in other words, jump in and get started now, or if you're already doing it, to get on even more podcasts. So let's have a look. I had a question come in from Nicholas Knight from, I think, Nicholas, you're in Arizona. And he talked about what are those top 5 things that I should have in my bio. So, or if I'm listing my, my talents and my genius on PodMatch.com, what should I include?
Yeah. So your bio, you really want it to be directed toward the person who's going to be reading it. So I'm going to take this from the guest standpoint that Nicholas, you want to be a guest. So if a host is going to read it, you want to be directed toward that. So you want to really answer the questions they're going to have. Like, when they look up and they see Nicholas, you don't want to be like, okay, who is this person? Like, I'm having trouble understanding. Really short, really precise. And I think the most important things to have is you lead with value is my first thing. So the number one thing you have on there is some sort of like, hey, I did this, and here's the value I add to somebody. Like, here's the way I can share my story. So when you do a lot of stats and Tanya, I know that you love stats, but if you do a lot of stats in here, like in 2004, I did this and this and this and this, like you have all these numbers, that doesn't necessarily work really well in a bio.
No, it's fine for an interview, but no. I'm all for, when it comes to getting booked, story-based pitches, because your story is what makes you unique.
Yeah, so a bio should just be straight to the point, really short, lead with the value, give the information that's needed, and I think that's the best thing you can do. What I always like to do is practice by reading the bio that I write. So for me, a lot of hosts are just going to literally use the bio that you write, And I initially didn't do this. It was way too long. I'm like on podcast waiting to talk when they're introducing me. I'm like, oh my gosh, this Alex guy sounds so annoying. I'm like, I don't even want to hear him, right? So I made it really short, really condensed, just what needs to be there, leading with the value. It's like 3 sentences now, and people can get through it really fast. And it's like, oh wow, Alex has like done this and he's here to help with this. That's great. Like that's really a great thing to have. So I don't think there's a top 5 things necessarily. I know that doesn't directly answer the question. I think it's short, precise. Just know if someone else is gonna be reading it, you want it to sound the way that you'd want it to sound. So practice reading it yourself as well. And think about if someone was like announcing you to walk on stage, like listen to what they were gonna say. Like what would you want them to say about you if you're getting ready to walk up? Like really think about that. And I think that's an important way to really think about this.
Yeah, and I think, I always one of the ways I look at it too, Alex, is I think about, if you're new to a podcast, I mean, imagine this is your podcast and someone pitches to you and you've never had them on the show before. If they tank, it's you that looks bad, right? Mm-hmm. So you're trying to reassure the podcast host that the gamble that they are taking is going to be a great gamble. So you're trying to speak to unspoken objections and show your uniqueness, show that you're fresh. Because just like when you're making a sale to your audience, that's your audience. Well, the sale you're going for here is the person who books you on the podcast. So, it really does need to speak to that particular audience, as you were saying. And Nicholas also asked, he also asked, and I'm not, this was an interesting question. What are the 5 things that must never be included in your bio? And I think you just said boring stats, and I have to agree with you there, even though I'm a stat nerd. What else would you not put on a bio? Or have you seen something where you're kind of like, oh my goodness, I can't believe they put that?
Yeah. Well, the next thing that you need after leading with value is to add your credibility. So something like if you did like a TEDx talk, like mention like able to help people with this, like, or I focus on helping this type of person with this. I did a TEDx talk about it in this date type of thing. Like you can add a little bit of that. But what I don't like is when people do a lot of self-serving things in their bio. So again, not a top 5 things, but just something that you don't do. Don't have like your whole like call to action link in there and be like, go to thiswebsite.com to accelerate your success. Get your free guide now. Like things like that in a bio make it seem like you're there to sell. And when you're there to sell, like personally, I won't have you on my show because I lead with value on my show. And if I feel like I'm going to bring someone on that's just going to be trying to sell something to my audience, I'm not into that. I think that happens really well organically. If you just let that come out during the conversation, people will connect with you and like you. And my audience, I can tell you this, they love buying books. I bring a lot of authors on, and I tell the people on there, I'm like, do not talk about your book or where to get it. Like, don't bring that up, because when you do, I've actually been able to prove that they sell less books when they do that. If you let me talk about it in the intro and outro, you're going to sell more books. And I didn't write the book, but I'm better at selling their book than they are to my audience. So again, if you see the self-serving in the bio, that to me is a bit of a red flag. So keep that out of there. And again, keep it really short. So like if I'm adding another thing, like just don't make it too long, because here's the thing, people who like to listen to podcasts, they like to listen to podcasts. They want to hear the content. They don't want to hear someone read 10 minutes of bio. They don't want to go read 10 minutes of bio. They want it to be really short. Wow, that was packaged well. This sounds like somebody I'm really interested in. And then they can kind of get into the content and find out if they really like you or not.
It's such gold that you're sharing with us. I can't thank you enough. And speaking of things I want to listen to, Angela had this question. She would love to know what are the top 3 subjects that audience want to learn about and listen to. I didn't put all of the question there, but she had some examples like, is it health? Is it business? Is it COVID? Is it branding? Is it fitness? Like, what's trending or what's hot right now? Or I don't know if you have a magic 8 ball, but what's hot in like 8 to 3 months time, when sometimes it takes that long to get booked on a podcast?
Yeah. I mean, it's really hard to know. It goes back to who your audience is ideally. So in all reality, most everything is always trending to some group of people. And that's what's important to think about. So, okay, like if you're someone that's in the health industry, think about what are the things that the health industry is talking about. That's what's trending there. And a great way to actually find this out is I like to go to Google Trends. So google.com/trends. You don't need a login or anything. You can just type in any keyword or key phrase and it'll show you how popular it is. You can even look by like localize it. So if I want to see what's popular in Florida, I can see what's going on there. And here's an example of this. Last year, I wanted to really be strategic with when I released episodes. Well, it's an entrepreneurship podcast, but I had an episode about friendship because I was realizing many of the entrepreneurs who were emailing into me were saying they don't have friendships in their life because they're so busy working a full-time job and their side hustle, because remember, they're early in their journey. And I realized, I'm like, wow, we need to talk about the importance of friendship. So I brought somebody on who's an entrepreneur to talk about friendships. And when I was thinking about when I wanted to post it, I went to google.com/trends, and I realized the last week of July, for some reason, the searches for friendship spike like crazy. It goes like off the charts. And it turns out there's like a friendship day every year. It's like a day on the calendar, some sort of non-official holiday or something like
I was going to ask you if that's what the case was.
Look, it took me a little bit. Actually, the person who is this friendship expert didn't even know that. But I knew that I wanted to post the episode right at that time. And that's what I did because it was what was trending at that time. So top 3 subjects is really hard to answer because, again, everything's always trending. But I will say during COVID, especially when it got started, almost every podcast switched to it. I wanted to keep consistent with what I was doing, but most people talked about it. And that actually gave them a boost because that's what was really going on. Other than that, entrepreneurship is a huge category. I believe sports is technically the biggest, and comedy is starting to really be up and coming. So those are like 3 topics or subjects that are really starting to get boosted. So entrepreneurship, sports, and comedy are things that are really people are going after now. And then obviously true crime is a category of its own. That's night and day compared to everything else.
Yeah. Okay. So let's say they're ready to now move forward imperfectly. They understand that podcasts are always trending in your industry, in your category anyway, but you can do the search that Alex was talking about with Google Trends. What about now that you're going to actually launch that podcast? This is a massive question that Pamela had, and because branding is such a huge area, and I did chat to Pamela and I said, when it comes to branding specifically, what do you mean? But when you are looking to create your podcast, what sort of things should you be thinking about with the branding? And I know like messaging comes into that, the type of podcast and audience, but do you have any kind of tips for someone ready to make that podcast that are thinking about creating that niche, creating that name, creating that branding?
Yeah, so the first thing that my mind always goes to is the name. And there's like SEO tricks in here as well. So for me, I made my podcast creating a brand. And number one, I'm not super creative. So when someone was like, well, what's it gonna be about? I'm like, well, about creating a brand. And they're like, what do you call it? I'm like, probably creating a brand because I don't know what else to come up with. And so that's what I did, but it actually ended up serving me really well, which I didn't realize. Still to this day, years after launching the podcast, when I poll my audience to ask them how they found my podcast, the most common response I get is, I wanted to learn how to create a brand. So I went into my podcast app, whatever app that might be, and typed in creating a brand because that's what I wanted to do. Guess what show comes up first? The show that's called Creating a Brand. So the first thing I think about is the name. And I know a lot of people like to be creative with it. And if you want to, that's great. I think if you have like a general business show, then get super creative because you'll never rank for like the words business or business strategy or business administration. But if you have like a really narrow focus and you've really narrowed down to like some sort of niche group of people, make it really specific to what that is, what they might actually be searching for, because not as many people are going to be searching for it. And also there might not be any podcast in that space with what's being looked for. And that'll really give you an organic boost. So that's the first thing I think of. The second thing is the other thing you see is the actual cover art of it. So the little icon you see everywhere, right? It's the little thing that's going to get someone to stop scrolling possibly. And there's no right or wrong answer for how to do this. But what I've noticed is as those icons seem to get smaller and smaller, I don't think it's my eyesight, by the way, Tanya. I think they're actually getting smaller on the different apps. At least I hope that's the case. But as they kind of seem to shrink a little bit, you need something that's going to really catch someone's eye. And that's big text and not a lot of words. I see a lot of people that they'll put like a full sentence on it. Like they'll say the name of the podcast in a full sentence. And that doesn't work because most people can't read it. I mean, it has to be right in front of your face to read it when it's really small. But if it just says, like mine just says creating a brand in all big letters. I saw another one that was about entrepreneurs that are in the social space. And it just says social entrepreneur in huge letters. And it stopped me from scrolling because it wasn't really flashy. It was just big letters. And it was like white on black or something like that. And like I've seen people that do like red with black text, like something that just pops and sticks out. So really think about those things that help you stand out initially really well.
I love what you said about creating a brand because, I love to be clever with words, or I try to be clever with words, I should say. But there's a time and a place to be clever with words, right? And when people go onto a podcast, just like even when they're going into Facebook to search for a group or a page, they're looking to solve a problem. And so they're using search terms to solve that problem. So if they go, how do I create a brand or how to create a brand? Exactly that comes up. So have a think. And I just thought that was really gold advice, Alex, because I hadn't thought about, I knew that from some things, but I hadn't really thought about that with a podcast. Because you think about podcasts and you think, Entrepreneur on Fire and this and that. And if you are wondering, by the way, guys, speaking of, well, is it worth having a look at PodMatch? Are there any big podcasts in there? Alex, I'll let you answer that. Do you have some big names inside your PodMatch?
Yeah, I actually really enjoy the smaller podcasts, so I don't usually talk about this too much, but it's a good question. Yeah, John Lee Dumas from Entrepreneurs on Fire is on there. He has his podcast on there as well. Jordan Harbinger joined. We have people like Brant Penvidic is on there, and we have a few other names that are onboarding right now that we're actually chatting with to get them on the platform. But yeah, there are those people on there, which is really cool. But for me personally, I really enjoy like the smaller podcasts with, again, the really narrow focused audience, because I know who I'm talking to, and that makes it really easy for me. But we've got the big names there too.
Well, I do too. And I think it comes, the publicist in me would say there's a couple of things going on there. I mean, I like the smaller podcasts that tend to have like a much more niched audience. They tend to have a much I've dipped off there, can be more lucrative, right? So those smaller podcasts can be income generating podcasts, but then those bigger name podcasts are great for authority and credibility, and they look great on media one sheets and one pages, and on your website, as seen on Entrepreneur on Fire or something like that. Right. So there's a place for both of them. There's what I call, from my PR background, expert positioning podcasts, and then there is income generating podcasts. And
I like that term. I'm using that. That's good.
you can have it. Yeah, but it's a really important point, because some people do just think, I just want to get on a really great big podcast, and then they get upset when it doesn't really lead anywhere, and then they think, well, podcasts don't work. No, right. Wrong podcast, wrong audience, potentially, but you can still leverage the fact that you appeared on this big name podcast to actually, make an impact and influence and increase your income as well. So we're coming back to the monetizing, which I know is also part of Pamela's question. How do I monetize it? We talked a little bit about that in terms of lead magnets, joint venture partnerships, affiliate commissions. What's a couple more? And let's come back to that question. I'm going to monetize it. How many should I be on per month?
Yeah. So regarding you being is actually, wow, your face got big there for a minute. Couldn't see me anymore. So when you're thinking about, okay, I'm going to be a guest, how often should I get on a podcast? It really depends on what you have going on, is the first thing I'm going to say. So if somebody, like example, I just talked to an author today that has a book coming out in 2 months, and he's ready to go on a podcast guesting tour, as he calls it, which I like the way that sounds. It sounds cool. So this guy's getting ready to do that, and his goal is to get on a podcast literally as often as he can. If he can get 2 or 3 a day, that's great. And talking about doing that for months, like this guy's going to get on 100 podcasts, which is a really cool thing to do, and he wants it all to be done before his launch of his book. And that's a great thing for him, because the more he gets on, the more potentially he has to sell his book. So there's that side of things. Now, if you have some sort of strategic coaching package or something like that, you don't want to be on 100 different shows. You want to be on the 5 or 10 that are absolutely the right one. They're going to bring a client for you, because if you're on 100, you can't keep up with that anymore, right? So you have to think about, okay, I'm going to really look at this audience and see if it's the right one. And that's when you can say, okay, this podcast has, let's just say 50 listeners. There's only 50 people listening to this podcast every month, but I think that my most ideal client is actually there. And let me put this in perspective, because we've been, I guess, I don't even know how to really say this, but social media has ruined us, for lack of a better term. We think big numbers only. So when we see someone got like 30 likes on something, like, that's not enough, that's not a lot, they can't be an authority figure. Oh, they only have 2,000 followers, not enough, can't be an authority figure. Like, that's kind of how our mind is. But podcasting is a little bit different than that. If I told you that I had a room right behind here, and you who's listening right now, if I was going to bring you to that room, and there is 50 people sitting in that room waiting to hear you talk, and they're interested in hearing you talk, and they're going to listen to you for an hour, would you be interested in that? And the answer is 100% of the time, yes, unless you're super scared of public speaking, right?
Heck yes. Yes.
But that's the power of podcasting. And when people, I'm going to flip over to the podcast host side real quick. When people are like, oh, I've only got 50 or 60 people listening every week, I think I'm going to stop the podcast. If I told you there was a room with 50 or 60 people showing up every single week, sitting in that chair, waiting for you to come talk to them, you would never miss a week. I mean, you'd be sick and you'd show up and find a way to push through it, because that's how valuable that seems to people. But again, when we think digital world, we think numbers have to be really big to matter, and that's just not the case. So going back to the guessing side of things, again, if you have that coaching package and you're trying to pick up clients, you have some sort of service you're doing, you don't need a lot. You just need to find the right ones. Now, I do like the consistency of it. So last year I was a guest on about 100 different podcasts, and that worked really well for me. It's actually the only way I marketed PodMatch last year. I didn't do any paid ads or anything like that. It was strictly going into people's podcasts that have the right audience and just talking to them, sharing my story, adding value. I never pushed it once. And that's just kind of what happened. We've grown huge. Like, we've done really well over the last few months with PodMatch just because of this strategy. So again, there's not necessarily a right number, but I do think the consistency is really important. Even once a week, I would say would be a really great thing to do. Or if you just don't have the capacity for that because you're actually getting clients from it, try once a month, but stay consistent, get your name out there as often as you can.
I love that. And yeah, I think that the big thing is my takeaway from that, and I love it, is that you marketed your business for free. Yes, it was some time, but all these different audiences you got in front of. And the cool thing about when you appear on a podcast is that you're brought in as an expert. So there's already this third-party validation. So it's not a cold audience anymore because someone said Alex is worth booking or Tanya's worth booking. You got to hear what they have to say. So you're already moved through that sort of cold audience into that warm audience. And if you had to pay for that in paid traffic, it would be very, very different. And you could do a podcast, from your home. And someone actually had a question about that. In fact, I'll circle back to Shelley in just a moment. Deborah had a question of, do I need a cute little recording booth to get started? Or, what can I do? So I guess we'll do that. And I'll circle back to Shelley's question, which dovetailed off when you were talking about finding the right podcast to speak on. We'll circle back to that. But, and you've got a pretty cool setup where you are. Does everyone have to have this cute little recording booth, Alex?
I was about to say it's not. This is literally me and my developer for PodMatch. He's my business partner. We were working in here today. So this background is literally what we were talking about today. This one was covered, but it was such a mess. I just erased it real quick. I'm using what I have. Most of us in today's world, we live and work at home now, right? And that's just the nature of it. And people are now willing to forgive others for that. I think a couple of years ago, maybe people wanted to see a real nice background and super polished and things like that. And yeah, that was nice. But now even your favorite news person you listen to is sitting in their living room, their cat jumps in the picture half the time. So something like that. You can hear their kids screaming in the background. The bar for perfection, I'm doing air quotes there, has really dropped a lot. People are more so looking for, can this person add value? Now, if you can make something nice, do it. If you can get rid of echo, if you can get rid of the dog barking in the background, please do that by all means. But it's not necessarily required. And at some point I plan on just getting a backdrop here and pulling it down when I'm going to do a recording because I like the space that I'm working in, but this is my environment. And actually I get a lot of compliments on the boards being behind me. People are like, oh, cool. Can you explain what's on the board? When it's a live type of thing, which is kind of fun. But I think to answer the question, you really don't need all that. I think that's a little bit of the noise. The main thing is starting with the value that you're going to add, do the best you can with what you have, and then build from there.
And podcasts too, and we talked about this when Alex, backstage before you came on, and I said to you, I'm going to give you a copy of this recording so you can slice it and dice it and you can recycle it. And that's the cool thing about podcasts too, isn't it? You can take that audio, you can create content for multiple platforms, you can get it transcribed, you can create a blog. What are your thoughts on that? Can you share? For those of you who don't know what the heck I'm talking about, do you want to dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, and I'll be brief on this but this is a really big topic. There's entire episodes I've done on this, but you're talking about basically repurposing content.
Yeah, I call it the multiplier formula is what I call it.
That's perfect. And that's exactly what it is. So this, we're doing an audio video platform. This is the top of the top. You can pull 10 seconds out of any part of this and you have great 10-second video. You can convert it to audio only. You can convert it to text. Here's the thing that I think a lot of content creators don't realize, and it's the amount of power that you have in such a small piece of content. This is going to be under 1 hour, but you could turn this into 8 months worth of content easily without any problem. And you never have to recreate anything. It's just a matter of repurposing this, multiplying it every chance you get. You can find single sentences that work. I had a guest on my show. His name is Brandon Turner. He's a big name in real estate. And he told me before we got started, he's like, hey, Alex, you and I, I'm not going to be looking at you. I have another camera over here. I'm going to be looking at when I'm answering your questions because I use that content later. So afterwards, I asked him, I'm like, hey, so how much content you think you got? And he's like, oh, with a podcast like this, because it was a topic that I don't ever get to talk about, he goes, about 6 months worth of content for my social media platforms. Done. Completely finished. He sent it off to a team. Now, most people are going to do it themselves that are listening, but someone like him, he has a full team that does it. But he sent it off, and yeah, he had 6 months of content from 45 minutes with me. That's the power of multiplying your content and using it, repurposing it, using it over and over again in all the different formats. Super powerful. I recommend everybody to do that.
Absolutely, and explained so beautifully. And suddenly what happens with that is you are literally being seen anywhere and everywhere. And that's really, really important for influence and authority, credibility, and positioning, particularly if you do want to be speaking on bigger stages or getting on more of those influencer podcasts as well. So really, really good use of time there. And they do talk about as well, Alex, that the more income you want to generate in your business, the more impact you want to have in the world, the more you need to be publishing. In fact, the bigger your dreams and your goals, the more content you need to be publishing. 80% of your time should be on content. But most people would see it the other way. And that's why I love, speaking and podcasts, because you can simply recycle, repurpose, and create really great content in a short period of time. Now, we have a live question that's just come in. So guys, if you do, we've got Alex here captive. I asked Alex, when do you have to go? And he's like, So, if you've got a question about podcasts, now is your time to be asking them, because Alex is an expert and he's going to give you that answer straight up here. One of I'm not sure who this was, but I can read the comments. I'm just going to share it with you guys. And that is that I'm the owner of a specialty retail store. I'm a big advocate of shop local. How do I find podcasts to be a guest on? And how do I get invited, booked to speak about this topic that I am passionate about? I'll let you start with that, Alex. I might jump in after.
Yeah, for sure. So first off, we say shop local. So if you're thinking local, one thing that's nice about PodMatch is we actually have a way you can filter by people that are closest to you, podcast hosts that are close to you, which is nice. So you can find people potentially in your same city. Now, we've not been around very long. So we have just over 5,000 members now. So chances are you probably won't have somebody who's your next door neighbor who's a podcaster be on there yet, but we will get there over time. So my first thing is find people that are in your area or a similar area so that you can really, again, add that value. Really important to do. And that's what I think you do. The first thing is you lead with value. So as you're somebody who owns this retail store, what have you learned about retail that could help other people in retail or whatever type of customer is that you serve? What can you say that will help them make that purchasing decision properly? So you have to think again, okay, what is the value that I can add? So I kind of give you two examples there. Again, going back to that first one, what can you say to another local shop owner, someone else who owns a shop, that you can really teach them about running it successfully? Like, what have you done? If you can find podcasts that are about that, about like running local stores and things like that, that'd be huge. Or if you say, okay, I'm really focused on this type of clothing, let me find fashion podcasts that are talking about this type of clothing, or if they haven't covered that topic yet, let me get on there. And that way you can really do some education, helping people understand, okay, that's when I would wear something like this, or that's how I'd use this. And I'm really out of this space. My wife used to own a boutique. I should know way more than I do about all this type of thing. But anyway,
you'll be in trouble.
Right. But anyway, that's kind of my thoughts on that. And I know that you had some as well, Tanya.
Oh, actually, no. I thought you responded to that beautifully. Yeah, I mean, I when I think about what podcast should I be on, exactly what you were talking about. There's many pitfalls in starting a retail business. There's often changes to legislation. Like one of the ways, and I'm just looking for one of these questions in here as well. One of the sorry guys, I'm just playing with some tech here right now. I talk about in PR, and this is also depending on how quickly it would take you to get booked onto a podcast, but quite often if you can be seen to be commentating on current trends that are coming up, that can be very powerful too. So if this was January, if we were last month and you owned a retail store, you might talk about top retail trends of 2020, maybe even top mistakes and what you forecast for the year ahead. And that then not just positions you as an expert in your retail store, but actually an expert in the industry, which will be very important for you if you do want to move outside, because we kind of have like our business brand and we also have our personal brand as well. So keeping an eye out for, there could be some changes in the retail industry from a policy legislative point of view, and you could actually be getting on some of those like Chamber of Commerce type business networking sites, talking about those changes, how to embrace them, how to overcome the pitfalls of them. And by doing that, you're again elevated because you're now talking about something that's current, you're adding to the conversation, and you really are creating that expert positioning. So that was the other piece that I would
I'll add one more thing to that. And it's that people do business with the people they know, like, and trust. And being a guest on some sort of, whether there's video or audio, people can really determine, do they know you? Are you sharing your story transparently? Do they like you? And they can learn these things from hearing you talk. It's different if you just do like a little social post with one of your products. Like they don't know if they know, like, or trust you. But when they can hear you like this, again, it sets you up as an authority and it answers that question for people, and they'd be more interested in doing business with you. I know when I've heard people on podcasts, I'm more likely to work with them because I feel like I actually know the individual on some level.
You know, the stat nerd in me did come across the
Here we
stat
go.
well, I know, right? And it was, I think it was again, it was in the 60% that people who listen, and I just didn't want to geek you all out on the stats. I felt there was enough in there, but it's well over 50% of people who listen to an advertiser or an expert on a podcast are much more likely to purchase from that business. And it was actually very similar statistics to video. It was a little bit less than video. So video, the statistics are about 75. Wow. It's like 75 or 82% of people are much more likely to purchase from someone where video is used or video used on their landing page. But podcast wasn't too far behind. It was, I want to say it was like 63% or something like that. And I found that quite interesting. So
that is really interesting.
Yeah. Okay. So what about getting started though? I want to come back to Shelley's question. Shelley, just to give you a little bit of background. Shelley helps high school students get into college debt-free. Like, I'm serious. She's got this very niche kind of group. It is very cool. Very niched business where she helps parents and their children get a scholarship and get access to all these different grants to get into college. So she's micro-niched, right? And so she's wondering, you know, how do I find the best podcast for my niche, and how do I get started?
Yeah, and so there's a million different directions you could try. So I'm glad you're asking this question, because you could go anywhere, like, and try to find these answers. The first thing I would do, and like we've been saying all along, is really figure out, okay, who is it that I serve really well? Like, figure out the type of podcast, general type. So again, it's like, you don't want to go on business podcasts necessarily. It's more education or some sort of like transitioning in life, right? Like, you need to find where those narrow ones are. And I don't know your space like you do, Shelley, but really figure that out and say, okay, I'm really looking for people that are going into college, like podcasts that are specifically for that. And you can start looking for those podcasts. And I start with just Google searches is really the best thing to do. The other thing you can do is, if you're bigger on any social media platforms, when I say bigger, like, you know how to use them, you know how to navigate them, start looking through Facebook groups and also LinkedIn groups, and see if you can actually find groups that are devoted to that. And normally there's a podcast associated with these groups we're finding, like people are starting them or have them, and find out in those groups, even if they don't have them, be like, hey, has anyone listened to a podcast on this topic? I'm just curious. And people can start giving you those leads. So again, I do always go to Google just so I can find something. It's a good place to start, but also really start doing some of your own digging and asking people to really find these things for you. And you'd be shocked how many people know podcasters. I mean, there are a lot of us out there, and podcasters like to introduce people to other podcasters, and they like to be introduced. So it's really an easy way to do it. So start even doing some of your own social media posts, asking for people to introduce you. It's a great way to do this. And then also, when you are on a podcast, ask if they know anyone else in the space. Like, hey, do you collaborate with any other podcasters in this space? Or has anyone ever really stood out to you that's a host themselves? They came on as a guest maybe as well. Ask those questions. And of course, use a program like PodMatch. I find that helps really well. Tanya will probably put the link up again for you. There you go. Look at that. Way on top of it there. You can try that and see if there's anybody on there that fits that demographic. But really, it's all about getting creative. So think past just like, okay, I'm going to sit here, I'm going to search through all these directories and go through here and do this and do this. Just really get strategic with how you think you can find those, and start just asking for leads. So every time you get a referral, just ask somebody else, and keep a database of this. It's really important to do. At first, we want to keep it in our head, but I recommend keeping like an Excel spreadsheet or numbers or whatever it is that you use on your device of choice. But make sure you're keeping track of it so you know where you've been and that you've used those leads and things like that. But that's a great way to really get started in this.
Yeah, I love that you mentioned that, Alex, because I myself use an Excel spreadsheet, and I'll have the name of the podcast, I'll have the link to the podcast, I'll have the date that I applied, I'll have any dates of any potential follow-up that I did. If I spoke to someone or I know the person I should speak to, I'll put their name in. So I just collate it all in, because just because you've also appeared on a podcast once doesn't mean that you can't come back on again. Right. And it's much easier as well. Like, if you go on and you deliver and you're a great guest, then you make their life easy. Right. Then they're going to make your life easy, because they're just going to have you back on because you were such a great guest. And And Alex, I like Google as well. So if I thought it was, great tips to Shelley. And I love that what you mentioned about actually speaking to other podcasters and saying, hey, if you had a guest on the show that's also got a podcast, and Shelley podcast swapping too. So for those of you who have podcasts, you can also podcast swap if it's a perfect match, right? If that avatar is right. Now, just to finish up, because I'm just mindful of the time and you've been so generous, Alex, if you hadn't yet started a podcast and you were thinking about it, is there a general length that your podcast should be?
So here's a stat for you. You love stats, right? You ready?
I do.
You're going to love this one. 50% of podcast listeners have reported that they think podcasts are too long. 50% of people who listen to podcasts have been polled, and they claim that they think that podcasts are too long. So the first thing I want to say is keep it short. Keep it short, keep it precise. The days of being able to...
How short is short? Are we talking about 12 minutes here? Are we talking about 25 minutes?
It's a good question. First off, Joe Rogan, like we all look at Joe Rogan, we're like, I'm going to do a 3-hour podcast. It's going to be super fun. Everyone's going to hear it.
Yeah, but we're not Joe Rogan.
Yeah, right. And listen, Joe Rogan seems like a cool guy. I've never finished a full episode ever. So anyway, for what that's worth. So I think that if you are doing a solo podcast where it's just you talking, that can be a lot for people to take in because you can cover so much information so fast. I've done solo casts, and you have to be careful how long they are. I found the sweet spot is 12 to 15 minutes. 12 to 15 minutes, and just keep it one topic, like really focused. And when you're like, oh, I have so much to say, great. Break that into 4 different episodes and keep them really short. And that's a really important way if you're going to do a solo cast. So just keep that in mind. If it's just you by yourself and you're not having guests, that's a really important point. So if you are going to do something that's an interview, I personally like between 25 and 35 minutes. That's kind of my spot. And when I look to see in my stats, I'm not like a stat junkie. Like I don't look all the time in my podcast stats and numbers, but I look enough to make sure that it's staying healthy. And what I noticed is when I used to have episodes that were 45 to 55 minutes, the finish rate was at 60 to 70%. When I dropped it down to 25 to 35 minutes, more people were actually finishing it. It was up in the high 90s when I did that. So for me, that was my sweet spot. And I think that works really well. Now, if you have a podcast where you're talking about like traumas that people have been through and they're sharing their life story, don't rush that. I mean, if they're telling you like step by step what they went through, like how it was affected, don't be like, cool, let's wrap this thing up. We're almost done here. Like if that's got to be a 45, 50-minute episode, that's fine because it's more in a story form anyway. And someone's going to really benefit from hearing that full story versus just trying to wrap it up really quick. For me, I'm sharing information. It's high level. It's entrepreneurship. We like it to be really fast. So between 25 and 35 minutes works for me, but just really think about what's the quickest you can do an episode and it be really good. So what's the fastest you can do this episode and it still be considered really good. So when you're doing an interview, it can be a little bit longer than solo, but again, keep it as short as you can because 50% of people are saying they're too long.
And consistency is key too. And when I was looking at those, the stats that I shared at the beginning, they talked about the number of people who listen daily and the number of people who listen monthly. How frequent should your podcast be? What's your sweet spot there, Alex?
This is a great question. I'm so glad you asked. This might be like the most important thing. So consistency is absolutely key to succeeding in podcasting. And there's some cases that say once a week is kind of the minimum that you should do. Like you shouldn't do past that. And I get that. I do my solo cast that I do. It's a faith-based podcast, Christianity. I talk about Jesus a lot. That's what I believe. And that's a 12 to 15-minute episode. It's once a month. I do the first Monday of every month. And here's why. Because I cannot commit to more than that. So for the last almost 5 years now, I missed one. I got super sick a couple of years back. I think I had COVID before everyone else did or something. I don't know. Anyway, so I missed 1 month in the last 5 years. But other than that, I've been able to keep up with it. But that's the best I could do. That's all I could do. So I tell people, hey, do the best you can. But there is a case saying that it should be at least once a week. Now, here's the thing that you don't want to do. You don't want to tell your audience, I'm going to do 2 episodes a week or 3 episodes a week. And then you only do 1 a week or 1 every other week. You need to commit to what you're going to do, and you need to make sure that you really stick with that. We talked about JLD earlier. John Lee Dumas from Entrepreneurs on Fire. I was on a random call with him one day. I don't even know why we were talking. And he goes, Alex, I listened to your podcast. And I was like, uh-oh, here it comes. And he goes, it's super good, man. He goes, you want to know what the only difference between my show and your show? I was like, sure. He goes, I have 7 years on you, and I've never missed an episode that I told my audience I would do. He goes, if you do the same thing in 7 years, you'll be where I am. And so let that be a testament to everybody, wherever you're at right now. Just make sure that you stay really consistent on what you're doing and commit to something. I recommend at least once a week. And if you can't do that, if you can only do every other week, then do every other week, but don't miss it for your audience ever.
Yeah, I love that, because a lot of people like think about that overnight success, but there's no such
Yeah.
thing as an overnight success, right? So Alex, you've been so generous with your time and your knowledge. For those who are watching that want to connect with you further, what is the best way to do that?
Yeah, the best thing to do is just go to creatingabrand.com. That's where my podcast is at. You can find ways to contact me. All my social links are there. Everything I'm involved in, I try to keep there. And of course, you have the PodMatch link where people can go to get actually a free membership. So make sure that you share that one again. So that's podmatch.com/signup/TTC. And those two things, you'll find everything I'm doing right there.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us. And guys, if you have a question, Alex, the comments have been great. We've had some comments coming in about, I've been wanting to start a podcast forever. Thank you so much. This is all really great info. Pamela was joining us live. And Pamela, I commented back, I hope that Alex answered your question for you. If you're watching the replay, guys, and you have a question, or you joined us a little bit late and you have a question, please leave it in the comments, and we'll twist Alex's arm and see if he can come in and answer those for you. And Alex, love to have you back again at another point if you're up for it. And, thank you so much.
Yeah, I'd like to share one more thing that I think is just really important in this topic. And it's a lot of people when they're starting in podcasting, they feel inadequate. They look at the other shows out there. They look at one like yours or mine that are really successful, and they're like, I'm not going to be that. Here's what I want to remind everybody. You have greatness and creativity within yourself. And what that means is that you uniquely have a way that you can serve the world. And as someone that has that ability within themselves, you owe it to the world to do that and to serve other people. So just remember, whatever the creativity is that you have, it's there. You can be great. You can do something amazing with a podcast. And I believe it's just one of the best mediums to really serve the world. So I challenge you, really think about that. Don't sell yourself short. You can do something amazing. You can change a life. So get out there. Remember, you have that greatness and creativity within yourself.
That's a great way to finish. Thank you, Alex. And guys, for those of you watching, go and check out PodMatch, and also use the power of the tribe here inside this Facebook group, because there are other speakers here, other podcast hosts here, people who want to be a podcast guest. Find out who is in this community, because you could also be podcast swapping, filling each other's content, and all growing your businesses together too. So I really encourage you to connect with one another. Alex, thank you so much for your time.
Absolutely. Cheers, Tanya.
Take care.